Hey guys, we're back in the home gym. Okay. Hey guys, we're back in the home gym. I wanted to talk to you about some stuff I've been seeing on social media when it comes to dieting. Now, I don't like the term dieting. I prefer the term nutrition. But a lot of the fad diets going around aren't very efficient. And let's talk about why. Some of the diets that I'm referring to, of course, are the carnivore diet, the keto diet, the paleo diet, maybe even the OMAD diet. So I want to focus on the first three. The carnivore diet and the paleo diet and the ketogenic diet are fairly similar in the way that they cut out processed foods or mostly carbohydrates. Now, the reason why that's a problem for most is that carbohydrates are your body's #1 preferred fuel source. And you've heard that tossed around as well, so I want to talk about what that really means. So your body requires nutrients to metabolize to exist, right? Carbohydrates are one of those main macronutrients. When you ingest carbohydrates, well, let's back up. There are 3 types of carbohydrates. There is the polysaccharide, that's more than 3 saccharides. I want you to think of starches, potatoes, for instance. Then you have disaccharides, or 2 saccharides. I want you to think about milks in that regard. And then you have monosaccharides. Those are your simple sugars that are just your basic glucose and even sucrose, and those things are easy metabolized. All of these saccharides have to break down into glucose. Now, that glucose then breaks down through the process of metabolizing to pyruvate acid. And that sounds really scary until we start talking about the Krebs cycle. So here's where we really get into the depths here of the creation of energy or the creation of adenosine triphosphate. You have something called a Krebs cycle. Now, we're not going to get into the intricacies of the biology of it all. It's not necessary to explain my point. I want you to think of the Krebs cycle as a clock, okay? And at the 12 o'clock of our clock, very top, you have a bouncer. That bouncer's there to check your credentials. And he'll open the door with his key if you have your credentials. And you'll need 3 things. You'll need pyruvate acid in the form of glucose or carbohydrates. You'll need oxygen, right? And you're going to need carbon-6 molecules, but you're made of carbon, so good job. Once you have those credentials, that little bouncer at the top of this Krebs cycle, he's going to open the front door to this Krebs cycle with his key, and that key is insulin. So if you have your carbon-6, which you do, you have your pyruvate because you had your carbs, and you have your oxygen because you're operating in your aerobic capacity, you're going to enter into that Krebs cycle at the 12 o'clock, at that front door. Once that happens, you're going to bounce around in there and do a whole bunch of science mumbo-jumbo and create a bunch of ATP, right? 34 to 38, and that's a lot. So let's talk about, what if we don't have carbohydrates? What if we've decided to do one of these ketogenic diets or low carb diets? This is where we get into some trouble long term. If you show up to the front door, the bouncer is going to check your credentials and you'll have your carbon and you might have your oxygen if you're operating in your aerobic capacity, but you don't have your pyruvate acid because you're low on glucose. Well, because you don't have any carbs on board. So this little dude, he's going to say, don't worry, I got you. He's going to run over to your fat stores, your liver, your kidneys, maybe just your adipose tissue cells. Now, he's going to take that fat source and he's going to turn it into glucose. Well, that's fine, but it's called gluconeogenesis, creating glucose from a non-glucose source. Now, what does that do? That gets you readily available glucose, but there's a negative byproduct. We'll talk about that in a second. So let's say that he gets back with this glucose and he hands it to you, says, yeah, you can go in, right? Well, all that moving around took ATP, right? It took energy. So now you're in a deficit of ATP. You got to make it up, right? And you're less efficient at doing so for other science mumbo jumbo. So by the time you get out of the Krebs cycle at that point, you only come out with 2 ATP as opposed to the 36 to 38 that we talked about originally. So with that being said, you're more sluggish and you're tired. You have less energy, right? This on a micro scale, perfectly fine. But utilizing fat as your #1 fuel source has a negative byproduct of ketones, right? You've heard everybody and their mom talk about how they want to be in ketosis, right? There's even breathalyzers to test if you're in ketosis. High levels of ketones are acidotic to your body's metabolic system, right? What do I mean by that? You have a pH scale in your body, right? If you become more acidotic or more basic, that pH scale can shift, causing metabolic issues. So if you have a high level of acid, you can become metabolically acidotic, which leads to respiratory drive concerns and can be even damaging to your organs long term. Now, bodybuilders who cycle carbohydrates and go on low carb diets to shed water, that's different. Now, why do people cut carbohydrates to shed water? We've talked about this in a previous video, but 1 gram of carbohydrates can hold on to 4 grams of water, including sodium, could be even more. So 946 grams of carbohydrates can hold on to a gallon of water, which weighs just over 8 pounds. It's incredible. And it's not hard to make those numbers happen over a day or two, especially if you eat out a lot. That being said, if you're in a consistent caloric deficit, your body will utilize some of that fat as energy. And when that happens, it happens in small doses, which means that it's much more sustainable long term. So when we're talking about a caloric deficit here, we're talking about the standard 500 calories less a day than your maintenance calories. We've talked about maintenance calories in a previous video, but I want to talk about that number 500 just a little bit more right now. Why is that important? If a higher caloric deficit means that I'm going to lose more weight, then why not create a larger caloric deficit? Why not do a bunch of cardio? Or why not eat less? You can do that. You can go on an aggressive cut, as they call them. Anything over 500 calories a day in a deficit would be considered an aggressive cut. But in cutting that many calories, your body produces hormones, hunger hormones, naturally. These are natural things. There's 2 hormones that are in charge of your body's hunger levels. There's ghrelin. Now I call ghrelin the gremlin because the longer you don't eat, the more ghrelin is released into your system. And the gremlin comes out and he punches you in, he makes you pick up a fork and he makes you eat. Now, the crappy part about ghrelin is that it is not a one-dose-fits-all hormone. The longer you go without eating, the longer your stomach is empty, the more ghrelin is released, causing cramps and hunger pains. This is a biological response to you being hungry, and it is a fight or flight mechanism. It's there to keep you alive. It's incredible, but it sucks. That being said, the opposite is true as well. You have an opposing hormone called leptin. Leptin is your satiety hormone. And the crappy part about ghrelin is the cool part about leptin. Leptin is not a one-dose-fits-all hormone. You can have foods that are higher in satiety, meaning that they cause a higher release of leptin, the hormone, which means you can eat less of that and be fuller for longer. Some of those foods are higher in carbohydrates, higher in protein, and higher in fiber, because fiber is the carbs your body doesn't want. That's why it keeps you regular. Those foods take longer to break down. I should say complex carbohydrates. Those foods take longer to break down, which means you stay fuller for longer. It's almost like biohacking. So what kind of foods do that? Lentils, beans, eggs, fish, and the number one, potatoes. Potatoes are the highest on the food satiety scale, and fun fact, they are less in calorie per gram than white rice. So every bodybuilder ever has got it wrong. I love potatoes. I eat a ton of them. So carbohydrates are your friend. So that's the importance of carbohydrates, your body's number one preferred fuel source. That's how that works. So please stop doing the ketogenic diet, the paleo diet, the carnivore diet. Foods or diets that cut out one entire macronutrient is never a good plan. Any diet that has a name probably isn't built specifically for you. Unless you have a pre-existing medical condition or maybe even a new diagnosis of insulin resistance, diabetes, things of that nature that can cause you to need a specific diet of lower carbohydrates, you need carbs. You need carbohydrates. Listen to your body. The ketogenic diet has something at the beginning phases of that diet called the keto flu. I don't know about you, but I don't want to start a weight loss journey looking forward to flu-like symptoms. It's not necessary, I promise, okay? Water retention and water weight is not real body fat, okay? So you can do this. Count your calories, remain consistent. Eat your carbohydrates. I promise you will see more results. We'll talk soon.